The first time Noah Hunter rode into Caldera Flats, 3 preachers crossed to the other side of the street without being asked, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath like a man who had just swallowed something he could not name. It was the spring of 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was a place of magnificent contradiction, golden light that fell like something sacred across the Red Mesa country, and violence that moved through the arroyos like flash floods, quick and indifferent. Caldera Flats sat in the belly of it all, a town of 800 souls pressed between a cattle empire to the north and a silver mining operation to the east that paid its workers in scrip and kept them permanently indebted to the company store. The church sat in the center of town like a white fist, its steeple the tallest structure for 40 miles in any direction, and its 3 rotating preachers, men named Beaumont, Greer, and Tulliver, governed the social order with the particular confidence of those who believe God has personally delegated them the task. Noah Hunter had been called Godless by each of them at one point or another, in one territory or another, and the reputation had followed him the way drought follows bad luck, with persistence and a certain inevitability. He was 31 years old and built like a man who had spent those years doing difficult things with his hands. His hair was the color of dark river water, and his eyes were a shade of gray that shifted between storm and stillness, depending on the light and his mood, which were often the same thing. He had scars he did not explain, and a quiet that was not peace but something older than peace, the kind of quiet that settles into a man after he has made himself stop expecting the world to be kind. He had come to Caldera Flats because of a letter from a man named Delos Marsh, who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, and who needed someone to track the men stealing from his herds. Noah was a tracker by trade and reputation. He found things: cattle, people, truth. He was exceptionally good at it, and he worked alone, and he charged honestly, and he had never in his professional life cared one measure of flour what a preacher thought of him. That was before Henrietta Sawyer. She was standing outside the dry goods store when he rode past, and she was arguing. That was the first thing he noticed, not her face, not the pale calico of her dress, but the sound of her voice, which was doing something he had not expected from a woman in a town like this one. She was not pleading. She was not backing down. She was explaining something with the patient precision of a person who has had to be right before and has learned to do it without apology. The man she was arguing with was large, red-faced, and carrying the particular posture of someone who had been told his whole life that his size constituted an opinion. He was the storekeeper, Noah would learn later, a man named Gideon Pratt who had a habit of adding fictional charges to the accounts of people who had no one to argue for them. That flour was 8 cents a pound last month, and it is 8 cents a pound now, Mr. Pratt, Henrietta was saying, and I have the ledger entry in my own hand to prove it, so I would appreciate it if you would correct the bill before I am forced to take this matter to someone who can make you correct it. Pratt looked at the ledger she was holding out toward him with the expression of a man who had miscalculated something important. Now, Miss Sawyer, prices fluctuate. They do not fluctuate backward in my ledger, sir. Noah had stopped his horse without meaning to. He sat there in the street watching her win an argument with her evidence and her composure, watching her stand her ground in her worn boots on the plank boardwalk, and he felt something shift inside him that he could not immediately locate or explain. It was uncomfortable and interesting in equal measure. She won. Pratt corrected the bill with the martyred expression of a man who has been defeated by something he cannot physically push back against. Henrietta tucked the corrected receipt into her leather ledger with brisk satisfaction and turned to leave. She noticed Noah then. She did not look away the way most people did when they found him watching them. She looked back at him with steady brown eyes that held the specific quality of someone who has already decided she is not going to be afraid of things just because they look uncertain. "Something you needed, mister," she said, not unkindly. "No, ma'am," Noah said, "just passing." "Then you might want to keep going," she said pleasantly. "You are blocking the street." He nudged his horse forward. He looked back once, which was once more than he usually did, and she had already turned away, already moving toward whatever came next in her day. He thought about that for longer than was sensible. Delos Marsh operated his cattle empire from a ranch house that was, by the standards of the territory, something close to a palace, 2 stories, glass windows, a cook imported from Santa Fe. He was 60 years old, sharp as broken flint, and had the calculating eyes of a man who had built something large by understanding, very early, that most people would trade almost anything for certainty. He received Noah in the main room, poured good whiskey, and laid out the problem with the economy of a man who charged himself for wasted words. 30 head a month for 6 months, Marsh said. Not random, selective. They take the branded animals and leave the unbranded ones, which means they know the operation. Someone local, someone who can move cattle through the territory without raising questions. Any suspects? Noah said. Several, no evidence. Marsh looked at him steadily. I need evidence, Mr. Hunter, not suspicion. Evidence that will hold in a territorial court. That is what I find, Noah said. I know what you find. That is why I wrote to you. Marsh set down his glass. There are people in this town who will not speak to you. You should know that. Your reputation precedes you. It usually does. Reverend Beaumont in particular has been quite vocal about the dangers of bringing a man of your character into a God-fearing community. Marsh said this without visible embarrassment, the way people in his position delivered bad news as information, not apology. I do not require the Reverend's approval to track cattle, Mr. Marsh. No. But you will need the town's cooperation to gather information. And right now the town is inclined to freeze you out because 3 men who speak on Sunday mornings have told them to. Marsh refilled both glasses. I suggest you find a way around that. Noah took his room at the Caldera Hotel, which was the only establishment in town that would give him one without requiring a church affiliation letter. A peculiarity of Beaumont's influence that had driven away 2 doctors and a lawyer in recent years, a fact the town was only beginning to recognize as a problem. He started the next morning, before sunrise, writing the fence lines of the Marsh operation, reading the land the way he had taught himself to read it, not as scenery but as text, full of information if you knew what questions to ask of it. The cattle were being moved northeast, through a narrow canyon passage that not many people knew about. The tracks were old enough that they told him history rather than direction, but history was where he always started. He was back in town by mid-morning, and he saw her again. Henrietta Sawyer ran the town's only school. He learned this from the hotel's proprietor, a wiry, cheerful man named Sam Wicks who seemed constitutionally incapable of conducting a conversation in fewer than 400 words. Miss Henrietta Sawyer, Sam said, wiping the bar with a cloth that was not accomplishing much. Came out from Missouri 2 years ago. Took over the schoolhouse after old Mays died of the fever. She has got 31 children in that building and she teaches all of them, 1st through 8th reader, and she coaches the older ones for the territorial examination. He paused to let the impressiveness of this settle. The preachers do not love her. She keeps teaching the mining children alongside the cattle family's children, and Beaumont feels that the 2 groups should not mix on account of the moral influence or some such. She ignores him completely. Politely, but completely. She seems capable of that, Noah said. Sam looked at him with the bright-eyed assessment of a man who notices things and files them. You have met her, briefly. Sam went back to the not very clean cloth. She is a good woman, Mr. Hunter, the real article. Whatever you are thinking, I would recommend thinking it respectfully. I was not thinking anything in particular, Noah said, which was a lie, and Sam's expression suggested he knew it. Noah spent his afternoons in the first week working the perimeter of the cattle operation, mapping the routes, speaking to the ranch hands in the careful, patient way that eventually got people talking, not by pushing, but by staying long enough that they forgot to be guarded. He ate supper at the hotel dining room and drank 1 whiskey in the evenings and turned in early. He saw Henrietta Sawyer every morning. The school sat 2 streets from the hotel, and her route to it took her past the livery where he stabled his horse, and he began, in a way that he refused to examine too carefully, to arrange his morning check on the horse to coincide with that passage. It was petty and obvious and entirely unlike him, and he did it anyway. On the 4th morning she stopped. "You are the tracker Mr. Marsh hired," she said. It was not a question. "No, a hunter," he said. "Henrietta Sawyer." She studied him with that same direct quality he had noticed the first time. "Reverend Beaumont preached about you on Sunday. He said Delos Marsh had imported a godless wanderer to fill the town with violence and irreverence." "I have not done any violence yet," Noah said. "No." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. He did tend to get ahead of the evidence. She shifted the stack of books she was carrying. "Are you settling in well enough? I imagine the town is not entirely welcoming." "I have been in less welcoming places." "That is a patient answer." She considered him a moment longer. This woman who had already fixed her ledger and won her argument, and arranged 31 children of different social classes in the same schoolroom with what he suspected, was the same calm precision she brought to everything. "The mining family's children come to my school, Mr. Hunter. Their parents work long hours and do not have much time or energy for conversation, and the cattle ranchers' wives do not much acknowledge them in public. If you need people who will speak honestly and who do not owe anything to Marsh or to the preachers, those are your people." He looked at her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because 30 head of cattle a month is a significant theft," she said. "And because the man I suspect of organizing it also employs 3 men who make it their business to intimidate any miner who speaks about what he sees, and I would like very much for someone to do something about that." She said this with the same measured precision she brought to the flour prices. Then she adjusted her books and added, "Good morning, Mr. Hunter." She walked away up the street toward the school, and he watched her go, and what had shifted in him the first day shifted again, settling into something more specific and considerably more inconvenient. The man she suspected, as she confirmed in their next conversation, which took place on the 5th morning with the ease of something that has become a mild habit, was a man named Cutter Price, who ran a freighting operation between Caldera Flats and the mining camps, and who had extensive knowledge of the territory's canyon routes. "I cannot tell you how I know," Henrietta said. "A student told me something her father said at supper, and I do not bring children into legal matters, but the direction of the information is correct." "The Northeast Canyon routes," Noah said. She looked at him. "You already knew the direction." "The land told me." "You have confirmed the operator." He considered this. "You are a useful person, Miss Sawyer." "I teach 31 children in a single room on a salary that is 3 months in arrears," she said dryly. "I have learned to be efficient." He wanted to ask about the arrears. He wanted to ask several things, which was unusual. He generally had very little interest in conversation beyond what was operationally necessary. But she was standing in the morning light with the red mesa country behind her, and her brown eyes holding that quality of someone who has decided to be honest, and asking her things felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Helping me. Beaumont has told the whole town not to cooperate." She was quiet for a moment in a way that was thoughtful rather than evasive. "Because those children's fathers are being robbed twice," she said finally. "Once by the company that pays them in scrip and overcharges them for rent and food, and once by whoever is stealing the cattle that might otherwise employ them at decent wages if the ranching industry grew. I will not sit in my schoolroom and watch injustice organize itself on both sides of the same street and say nothing because a preacher told me it is not my business." She said this without particular heat, as a matter of settled personal policy. "It is very much my business, Mr. Hunter. Those are my children." He thought, not for the first time, that he had never met a person quite like her. He thought about this a great deal more over the following days, which was the specific problem of being drawn to someone. It colonized the mental space you needed for other things and refused to be reasoned out of it. He found his evidence in the second week. It came from a combination of physical tracking boot prints in the canyon mud that matched a pattern he had seen at Price's freighting yard, along with the distinctive iron-shod impressions of horses shod at the Price operation's personal blacksmith, which used a slightly irregular shoe pattern, and from conversation. Not with a mining family in the end, but with a young man of 17 who worked at the Price freight yard loading wagons, who had seen things he had not known how to interpret until Noah explained, patiently, what they meant. The boy's name was Marcus Webb, and he had a younger sister in Henrietta's school, and he had been frightened to speak until Noah sat with him for 2 hours in the back corner of the freight yard on a quiet afternoon and was simply, unhurriedly present, which was a skill he had learned, and which he now recognized as probably the most valuable thing he owned. "I saw them bring cattle through in the pre-dawn hours," Marcus said finally. 4 times. "I did not know they were stolen. I thought Price was buying them." "What did you see specifically?" Noah asked. The boy described it, the brands, the number of animals, the men involved, 3 of them besides Price himself. One of them was a ranch hand who worked for Marsh, which confirmed the inside operator. Noah wrote everything down in his small leather notebook, asked clarifying questions, and thanked the boy with quiet seriousness that indicated he understood what this conversation had cost him. "Are you going to be safe?" Noah asked. Marcus looked at him with the specific expression of a young person who has spent his life in a dangerous place and has learned to calculate such things accurately. "I will be safer once Price is not in a position to give orders," he said. "That will happen soon," Noah said. He delivered the evidence to Delos Marsh that evening and to the territorial marshal the following morning. Cutter Price and his 3 accomplices, including the inside man at Marsh's ranch, were arrested on a Thursday in the 3rd week of May, and the whole town came out to watch it happen with the complicated expression of a community that has known something was wrong and has been waiting for someone to do something about it. He found Henrietta outside the school watching the marshal's deputies ride past with the 4 men in custody. She had her arms crossed and her expression was the careful neutral of someone managing a strong feeling in a public place. "Marcus Webb," she said when Noah stopped beside her. "You spoke to him." "He wanted to help," Noah said. "He did the difficult thing." "He is a good young man." She paused. "Is he safe?" "Yes. Price will stand trial in Santa Fe. He will not be back here." She exhaled, and that exhale had the texture of something she had been holding for a while. "Good," she said quietly. "Good." They stood together for a moment in the warm morning, the dust of the deputy's passage still hanging in the air, and Noah was aware with a precision that surprised him of exactly how close she was standing, and exactly what that proximity did to his concentration. "Your commission from Marsh," she said. "I imagine you will be moving on now." "I imagine so," he said, and heard in his own voice the specific flatness of a man saying something his actual feelings are voting against. She looked at him sideways. "You do not sound entirely certain." "I am not entirely certain," he said, which was more honest than he had intended. She looked at him fully then, and her expression held something careful and open at the same time, the particular combination he was coming to associate with her specifically. The armor and the invitation both present simultaneously, each one honest. "There is a social supper at the church hall on Saturday," she said. "The preachers will all be there. I will also be there because several of my students' families will be there and I like to support them." She paused. "I mention this not as an invitation for you, since I imagine the preacher's presence would be a deterrent, but simply as information." "Information," he said. "I teach children," she said, a hint of something warm moving through her voice. "I am very good at presenting information neutrally and letting people draw their own conclusions." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. And then she smiled, not the careful, managed expression she wore in public, but something genuine and quick and slightly astonished at itself, as though she had not expected to, and it did something to his chest that he could not have described with the vocabulary currently available to him. "Good morning, Mr. Hunter," she said, and went back inside. He went to the Saturday supper. He was aware of the exact nature of the risk he was taking, walking into a church hall full of people who had been told, by men who spoke in the voice of moral authority, that he was not fit for their company. He was aware that his presence would cause talk, and that the talk would circle back to Henrietta and complicate her life in ways she had not asked for. He went anyway, because she had given him information about a supper she was attending, and he was not, whatever else he was, a man who misunderstood deliberate information. The hall went somewhat quiet when he walked in. Reverend Beaumont, a tall man with the deeply lined face of someone who has spent decades making the expression of spiritual disappointment, noticed him from across the room and made the particular tightening of the mouth that indicated incoming sermon. Henrietta was standing with a group of mining families near the food tables. She saw him come in. Something in her posture, just a small thing, a slight forward lean, a readiness shifted. Beaumont materialized at Noah's side with the efficiency of a man who has been practicing interception. "Mr. Hunter," he said, "I must say I am surprised to find you here." "Are you, Reverend?" Noah said pleasantly. "My understanding was that this was a community supper. I am part of the community." "You are a temporary resident," Beaumont said, "and one whose influence I cannot in good conscience recommend to my flock. What specifically troubles you about my influence?" Noah said. Beaumont blinked. People did not usually ask him that. "Your reputation," he said, recovering. "Your manner of living, your apparent disregard for the principles that make a society civilized." "What principles have I disregarded?" Noah said. "I would like to know precisely." "You drink," Beaumont said. "One whiskey in the evening, yes." There are rumors," Noah said, and let the word sit there with all the weight of its inadequacy. Beaumont pivoted to something firmer. "You associate with disreputable persons. In Tucson, in Las Cruces, I found stolen cattle in Tucson and brought evidence of a land fraud scheme to the territorial courts in Las Cruces," Noah said. "The men I associated with were suspects in those cases. It is rather the nature of the work." He said this with the tone of someone explaining something obvious without condescension, which was a line he walked carefully. "I have no quarrel with you, Reverend. If I have behaved in a way that has caused you genuine concern, I am willing to hear it. But I will not accept a reputation assembled from rumor as though it were evidence, and I suspect you know, in your deeper self, that God generally prefers evidence." The silence around them had expanded. People were not exactly listening, but they were not exactly not listening either. Beaumont's face had taken on a color that indicated he was in emotional territory he had not anticipated. He gathered himself. "I shall pray for you, Mr. Hunter." "I appreciate it," Noah said. "Good evening, Reverend." He walked toward the food table, and the silence reorganized itself into careful murmuring, and he found himself beside Henrietta, who was looking at him with an expression that was doing battle with itself. "You argued with a preacher in his own church hall," she said very quietly. "He came to me," Noah said. "He is going to preach about you for 3 Sundays running." He was going to do that anyway. Noah picked up a piece of cornbread from the table because he was actually hungry and it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. "Am I a problem for you, being here?" She considered this with the honest seriousness she brought to everything. "You are a complication," she said, "which is different." She paused. "You argued very well." He did not land a single solid blow. "I have had practice," Noah said. "People have been calling me Godless since I was 20 years old. At some point you either accept the label or you learn to contest it. And you chose to contest it." "Not always," he looked at her. "Tonight I chose to." She understood what he meant. He could tell by the way her eyes held his for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. "Well," she said quietly, "you did it well." They talked for most of the evening, which was not subtle, and which generated the exact amount of talk he had predicted, and he found that he could not bring himself to moderate it. She talked about her students with a passion that was not performed. She knew each of them by name and temperament, and what they were afraid of, and what they were capable of. And she talked about the older ones, the ones close to the territorial examination age, with the specific tender investment of a person who believes absolutely that other people's potential is real and worth the work. She talked about Missouri, where she had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had run a small lending library from their front room. Both parents were gone, her father of pneumonia in 1874, her mother the following year, grief having apparently decided to be efficient. She had come west because she had received word that Caldera Flats needed a teacher, and because Missouri without her parents had felt like a house whose walls were still standing but whose foundation had shifted in some way she could not repair by staying. She told him this with the particular plainness of someone who has processed the grief enough to speak of it without being undone by it. He listened without filling the pauses with something easier. "You lost people too," she said eventually. It was not precisely a question. "Yes," he said. "Would you tell me about it someday?" He thought about that. He had not talked about it to anyone. The habit of silence around the difficult things was very old in him and very fixed. "I think I might," he said, which surprised him. She smiled again, that quick, genuine smile that did the thing to his chest. "That is a remarkably promising maybe," she said. He walked her home at the end of the evening. It was a small house 2 streets from the school, neat and spare, with a kitchen garden that showed evidence of determined attention. They stood at her gate in the warm dark, the stars very large and closed the way they were in the high desert, and he was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them, not the absence of things to say but the particular fullness of a moment that does not need to be filled. "I am glad you came," she said. "So am I," he said. "What are your plans?" she asked. "Now that the Marsh business is concluded." "I had not," he said carefully, "made any plans." She looked at him with the expression of someone who is deciding something. "I have a fence that needs repairing," she said. "The back corner of my kitchen garden. I have been meaning to see to it for a month. If you were to remain in the area for a few more days, the lumber yard on 2nd Street sells fence posts and I would pay you fairly." "Miss Sawyer," he said slowly, "I believe you are inventing reasons for me to stay." "I believe," she said with serene composure, "that my garden fence is genuinely in need of repair. What you do with that information is entirely your own business." She opened the gate. "Good night, Mr. Hunter." "Good night," he said. He bought fence posts from the lumber yard the following Monday. He fixed the fence that afternoon while she was teaching school, and he also repaired the section of her roof that had developed a worried-looking sag over the front porch, because it was there, and because he had the tools, and because doing something with his hands was the way he organized difficult thoughts. She came home from school to find him on her porch roof, and she stood in her front yard and looked up at him with her arms crossed and something warm happening in her expression. "You have exceeded the brief considerably," she said. "The roof needed it," he said. "And what do I owe you for the roof?" "Nothing," he said. "The fence covered it." "That is not mathematically honest, Mr. Hunter." "Miss Sawyer," he said, coming down from the roof with the careful ease of someone who has spent a lot of time on ladders, "you told me where to find the mining families. That information was worth considerably more than fence posts and a roof section." She thought about this with a slight tilt of her head. "Supper," she decided. "You will stay for supper and we will call it settled." He stayed for supper, and it was the best meal he had eaten in 2 years, not because she was a remarkable cook, though she was competent enough, but because the table was small and the kitchen was warm, and the conversation moved between things that mattered and things that were simply pleasant with the naturalness of people who have discovered that the space between them is good space. He told her about his brother. He had not planned to. She had not asked. But she was talking about her father, about the lending library, and the way her father used to read aloud with a different voice for each character, and something about it created an opening he had not expected. "My brother was called Daniel," he said. She went very quiet. "He died in 1871. We were working a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas, and there was a dispute at a river crossing about grazing rights. He tried to negotiate it. He was better at that than I was. He stopped, started again. He was 26. He was the kind of person who tried to negotiate things. And you, she said gently, are the kind of person who tracks what caused the problem and brings evidence of it to the proper authority. He looked at her. That is a generous interpretation. It is an accurate one, she said. What you do is not senseless wandering, Mr. Hunter. It is a vocation. You go to places where something has gone wrong and you find the truth of it. That is not nothing. She said this with quiet certainty, the way she said everything she meant. It is not nothing at all. He was quiet for a long moment, and the kitchen was quiet around them, and outside the desert night settled in with its enormous sky and its smell of sage and warm rock, and he was aware of something inside him that had been arranged around an absence shifting towards something that was not an absence at all. You are the first person, he said slowly, who has ever suggested that what I do is something other than evidence of my general unsuitability for civilized company. Well, she said, civilized company has a rather limited definition in my experience. Her eyes held his across the small table, and the preachers of this territory appear to have an even more limited definition still. You said Beaumont was going to preach about me for 3 Sundays, he said. He did. She smiled slightly. I was not present for any of them. I spent those 3 Sunday mornings working with 4 of my older students on their examination preparation. On purpose. He said, I am always on purpose, Mr. Hunter, she said. It is one of my more consistent qualities. He laughed. It was the first time in longer than he could accurately remember that he had laughed at something said in conversation, and it came out of him with the slightly surprised quality of something that has forgotten it knows how to happen. She looked at him with an expression that was delight and something deeper, something that she allowed him to see before she looked away. He walked home under the enormous sky, and he thought about Daniel, and about Henrietta Sawyer, and about what it meant to be called godless, and about what it meant to be sitting in a warm kitchen with someone who argued with you as though your opinions were worth arguing against. And he thought that perhaps the preachers had been wrong about 1 or 2 things, which was more theological ground than he had covered in a decade. The weeks that followed were a kind of gradual accumulation. He did not have another case immediately. He was not looking for one. He had enough money set aside from the Marsh Commission to see him through several months, and he told himself this was the reason he remained in Caldera Flats, which was a story with some small amount of truth in it, and a considerably larger amount of something he was not yet calling by its right name. He helped at the school on 3 mornings when 2 of the mining family's older boys had been set to rough up the building's storage shed, and the situation needed calm male presence of a specific kind, not threatening but steady, someone the boys would read as having enough authority not to test. He sat on the school steps and talked to them about the canyon country, about tracking, about the way the land had its own language if you learned to listen for it, and they forgot entirely what they had come to do, and Henrietta watched from the doorway with an expression he was learning to read as the particular warmth she did not always broadcast publicly. He also went to church. This was perhaps the most unexpected development of the whole season, even to himself. He had not been inside a church voluntarily since he was 12 years old, and had been dragged to a revival meeting in Arkansas that had left him with a deep suspicion of any spiritual experience that required shouting and a collection plate. But he found himself, on a Sunday in June, drawn to the small, plain building not by any sudden theological awakening, but by a stubborn and specific refusal to allow 3 men who had never met him a single sovereign fact about him to define his relationship with something he genuinely was not certain of. The service was conducted by Reverend Greer, who was the least confrontational of the 3, a quieter man, older, with the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to have softened his opinions at their edges. Greer saw Noah come in and said nothing, and Noah sat in the back pew and listened with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He did not experience a conversion. He was not struck by lightning or moved to weeping. He sat in the back pew and listened to a passage read from Matthew about visiting the sick and the imprisoned and clothing the naked, and he thought that this at least sounded like something a person could actually do. Henrietta was there, 3 rows ahead. She did not know he had come in until the end, when the congregation turned to exchange a word with their neighbors, and she turned and found him there and went briefly very still with surprise. She walked back to him after the service, while the other congregants filed out and Greer watched from the front with an expression of cautious, non-triumphant pleasure. "Well," she said in a low voice, "this is new." "I had 3 preachers tell me I could not be in a church," he said quietly. "I find I object to being told what I cannot do without evidence." "Is that the only reason?" she asked. He looked at her. "No," he said, "it is not the only reason." They walked out together, and the congregation reorganized itself around this fact the way a river reorganizes around a new stone, finding new channels, making new patterns, and eventually, mostly, accepting it. Beaumont was standing on the church steps, having come from the other service. He looked at them both, and at the comfortable proximity of their walking, and his expression did something complicated. He was not a cruel man. Noah had come to understand. He was a frightened one, frightened of the disorder that came when people made their own determinations about grace and propriety. Fear made people do things that looked like cruelty from the outside, and sometimes from the inside too. "Miss Sawyer," Beaumont said. His voice had lost some of its certainty. "Reverend Beaumont," she said, with the pleasant, exact composure she always brought to authority that had not earned additional deference. "I trust you are keeping well," he said, which was not what he had started to say. "Very well, thank you," she said. "Shall we?" She said to Noah, and they walked past without the conversation becoming anything more than it was. "He is recalibrating," Noah said. "He does it slowly," she said, "but he does do it. I will give him that." The territorial examination happened at the end of July, and 4 of Henrietta's students sat it, and all 4 passed, which was the first time in the school's history that more than 2 students had passed in a single year. The news came back on a Friday afternoon, carried by the territorial mail, and Noah was at the fence line of the Wicks property. He had started doing small repair jobs for people in the town as a way of being useful during the interval between cases, when he heard it announced with a shout from Sam Wick's direction. He went to the school. Henrietta was standing in the empty schoolroom, the children all gone home for the day, with the letter in her hands and an expression on her face that undid him completely. She was crying, not dramatically, not with sound. Just quietly, with the tears running unchecked because she had forgotten to manage them, her face entirely open in a way he had never seen it, all of her armor set aside. Just this woman who had worked for 2 years in a single room with 31 children on a salary 3 months in arrears, and had loved it in them without reservation. And now 4 of her children had passed the territorial examination, and she was standing alone in the room and not managing anything at all. He stepped inside. She looked up and made an automatic motion to compose herself, and he said, "You do not have to do that," quietly, and she stopped, and her face stayed open, and he crossed the room and she let him put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and he held her carefully and firmly the way you hold something that matters enormously. They stood like that for a long moment in the warm schoolroom with the evening light coming through the windows, and he felt the precise weight of her in his arms and the precise reality of it, and something in him that had been arranged for solitude for a very long time recognized, with the particular ache of a thing finally naming itself, that he did not want to leave this place. "Thank you," she said against his shoulder after a while. "For what?" he said. "For not saying something consoling," she said. "I do not want consolation, I am just happy." "I know," he said, "I could tell." She pulled back slightly to look at him, and she was still somewhat wet-eyed, and she was not composed, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at in his life, which he recognized as a thought that was no longer in any territory he could pretend was casual. He told her, Not everything, not all of it at once, but the true and direct thing that was making itself impossible to continue not saying. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I should have told you before now." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes very bright. "Yes," she said, "you should have. Are you going to tell me something in return?" He said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "I am in love with you," she said, with the same plain directness she brought to everything that mattered. "I have been since approximately the morning you explained to a preacher what evidence actually requires." A small, wet, delighted laugh. It seemed like the relevant moment. He kissed her, which was the thing that had been waiting to happen for every day of the past 2 months, and it was exactly right, warm and careful and honest, which were the only qualities of his that had ever consistently served him well. And apparently they served him well in this context too, because she kissed him back with that same deliberate openness, and the schoolroom was quiet around them, and the evening light held them in it, and the world outside could wait. They were married in September. This itself was an event in the town's social life of considerable magnitude. The question of which preacher would perform the ceremony was resolved by Henrietta, who went to Reverend Greer and asked him directly, which was the kind of direct action she took when she wanted something done without unnecessary conflict. Greer was quietly delighted. "I have been hoping someone would ask me to do something useful," he told her, which was as close as he came to a public statement about his colleague's management of Noah's reputation. The ceremony was held on a Saturday in the early cool of September, when the Mesa country had taken on the deep autumn color that made it look like something from a painting of a better world. The church hall was filled, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. The mining families came, and most of the cattle ranchers' families, and Sam Wicks, who arrived early and wept throughout, which he was unashamed about. Marcus Webb came, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, and when Henrietta saw him there, she smiled at him with the specific warmth she reserved for people who had done hard and brave things. Beaumont did not come. Tulliver came and sat in the very back with the expression of a man conducting ongoing internal negotiations. Greer presided with a quiet joy that looked, Noah thought, like actual faith, the functional kind, the kind that did the work rather than just police the territory. Noah stood at the front of the church and watched Henrietta walk down the aisle, and felt the entire previous 10 years of his life resort themselves into something that made sense in a way they had not quite made before. Not a story of loss and wandering and useful skills employed in a landscape of other people's problems, but a story that had been, somehow, moving toward this room, this woman. This moment with the September light coming through the plain glass windows, and the whole complicated town of Caldera Flats gathered around them in witness. She reached him and he took her hand, and she looked at him with the full, unmanaged warmth of her real face, no armor, no composure maintained for the management of public spaces, just Henrietta, and he thought that he had been wrong about one fundamental thing for most of his adult life. He had thought he was a man who operated well without needing anything. He had confused the ability to survive without a thing for not needing it. He was learning the difference. The vows were the traditional ones, and he meant every word of every one of them with a seriousness that was so obvious on his face that there was not a dry eye in the front 3 rows, which included several women who had been privately skeptical about the whole enterprise. After the ceremony in the hall, while the assembled town ate and drank, and made the kind of social noise that communities make when they are celebrating something that has resolved a tension they had not quite known how to name, Noah stood with his wife, a word he was still acclimating to, that still rang in him with the specific resonance of something unprecedented, and Reverend Greer came and shook his hand. "I owe you an apology," Greer said, quietly, away from the others. "You do not," Noah said. "You were not the one who did it." "I allowed it to happen without objection," Greer said. "That is its own thing." He paused. "For what it is worth, I have read nothing in Scripture that condemns a man for being uncertain, only for pretending to be certain when he is not. You have always seemed to me to be honest about what you know and what you do not. That is more than most of us manage." Noah was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Whatever you are," Greer said with the small, wry warmth of a genuinely humble man, "you are honest and you are kind and you love her well. The rest of the theological questions can wait." Noah laughed, and across the room Henrietta looked over at the sound and smiled. They set up house together in Henrietta's small house, which was immediately larger and warmer for the second person in it, the way small spaces are when they are shared by the right people. Noah built a proper second bookshelf for the books that were already overflowing hers, and she put her ledger on the desk he made for her from elm wood from the lumber yard, and they had their first disagreement about whether the front room window needed a curtain. She said yes for the cold months. He said no for the light, which they resolved by purchasing a curtain that came down in November and came up in March, which satisfied both positions. It was a small and complete life, and it was, to Noah Hunter, who had spent a decade believing he was constitutionally unsuited for such things, the most extraordinary thing he had ever been part of. He took cases through the autumn and into winter. A cattle dispute 2 counties over, a missing person inquiry that turned out to be not a disappearance but an elopement, a fraud case involving falsified mining survey reports that took him 2 weeks in November to unravel. He was always home within the time he said he would be, and Henrietta received him back each time with the same warm, steady openness, always having saved something from supper, always with something to tell him about the school, always herself in the complete and unperformed way she was only when she was at home. The school got its budget corrected by the Territorial Education Board in January of 1879, which meant Henrietta's salary was brought current, and a second teacher was appointed to share the load. The second teacher was a young woman from Albuquerque named Clara Reyes, who was 23 and full of energy, and deeply impressed by the system Henrietta had already built, and they got along immediately and professionally in the way of 2 people who share both a vocation and a set of standards about what it requires. Beaumont left Caldera Flats in February for a posting in Colorado, where a new mining town needed a minister. His departure was not mourned broadly, though Henrietta was gracious about it, sending a note of professional farewell to his wife, who was a quiet woman named Mildred who had always seemed, Henrietta said to Noah privately, to be someone the territory would benefit from hearing more of and less from her husband. Tulliver stayed and, over the spring, began a gradual and somewhat awkward process of treating Noah like a human being, which Noah accepted with the patience he brought to most processes of change. In April, Noah discovered that Henrietta was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast on a Thursday morning, matter-of-factly, with the cup of coffee she was no longer drinking because it had become disagreeable to her sitting untouched beside her plate. She had been tracking the situation herself for 3 weeks with the methodical patience of a woman who prefers to confirm information before presenting it. "We are going to have a child," she said, "approximately in November, if my calculation is correct." He set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment, and everything inside him was doing something extremely large and not entirely manageable. "Are you well?" he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "Perfectly well," she said. "A little nauseated in the mornings, which is why I have not been drinking the coffee, but otherwise quite well." He reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a moment in the morning quiet. "A child," he said. "Yes." She was watching him with the expression she wore when she was letting him have a moment without rushing it. "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," he said. "I am—" He stopped. "I do not have the word for what I am." She squeezed his hand. "That is acceptable," she said. "I know what you mean anyway." He had always been a man whose interior life was larger than his vocabulary for it, and she had learned this, and did not require him to bridge the gap with performance. It was one of the many specific gifts of being known by someone who was paying genuine attention. The pregnancy was healthy. Henrietta continued teaching through May, when the school year finished, and spent the summer doing the work she always did during the long break, visiting students' families, planning the next year's curriculum, working with Clara on expanding the reader-level system to accommodate some particularly advanced children who needed more challenging material. She was indefatigable and only occasionally irritable, and when she was irritable it was generally because she had overdone something and her back was complaining, and Noah had learned to see this coming before she could and arrange for her to be seated somewhere comfortable before it became an issue. He was, she told him once in August, with the quality of someone reporting a genuine discovery, an extraordinarily attentive person. "You notice things before people say them," she said. "You always have." "I am a tracker," he said. "That is not tracking," she said. "That is caring. They look similar from the outside, but they are different things." She studied him with the particular warmth she brought to him when she was being most honest. "You care about people enormously. You always have. You simply did not believe you were allowed to show it, because showing it implies a position. It implies you think you belong somewhere, that you have a right to matter to someone, and you had spent too long being told that a man like you does not belong." He was very still. "I think the preachers did genuine harm," she said, quietly but without anger. "Not just the ones here. The ones before, whoever they were, whoever first decided that a man who carries doubt and does his work honestly and tries to leave things better than he found them is somehow less than a man who performs certainty on a Sunday morning." He thought about this for a long time. "You are a remarkable person," he said. "I know," she said, without false modesty, which was one of the things he loved most about her. "So are you. We are very well matched." The boy was born in November, on the 11th, in the middle of a night that had turned cold and bright and still. The midwife was a capable woman named Agatha Delray, who had attended half the births in the territory, and who moved through the small house with the calm authority of someone who has seen this many times and knows exactly what it requires. Noah sat outside the bedroom door for the hours it took, which were the longest hours of his adult life, and when he heard the cry, small and outraged and astoundingly real, he put his hands over his face and sat like that for a moment, which was as close as he came to the kind of prayer he had been told he was incapable of. The midwife opened the door. "A boy," she said, "both healthy." He went in. Henrietta was propped on the pillows looking exhausted and luminous and completely herself, in the specific way a person looks when they have just done the most significant thing they have ever done. The baby was in her arms, red-faced and already calming, and she looked up at Noah with her eyes very bright. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the word son rearranged everything in him the way the word wife had, but more so, or differently, with a different kind of weight. The weight of something that would continue past him, that would carry things forward, that was already its own whole person beginning the long, complicated project of being alive. "Daniel," Henrietta said, "if you agree." He looked at her. He had told her about his brother, about the river crossing, about the man who tried to negotiate things. He had not expected her to. "If you agree," she said again, gently. "Yes," he said. His voice was very rough. "Yes, Daniel." She shifted so he could hold the baby, and he held his son for the first time with the careful, absolute attention he brought to everything that mattered enormously. And Daniel Hunter, who had just arrived in the world on a cold November night in the New Mexico territory, looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient-seeming gaze of the very new, and Noah held him and did not say anything, and did not need to. Sam Wicks brought whiskey and flowers the next morning and wept, predictably, with great enthusiasm. Clara Reyes came with a food basket and sat with Henrietta for an hour while Noah handled a string of visitors with the calm efficiency of a man who has learned to manage his own need for quiet by doing useful things. Marcus Webb came by in the afternoon, hat in hand, 20 years old now and working a proper wage at the freight yard under new management, and Noah shook his hand on the porch while Henrietta rested inside. "A boy," Noah told him. "Congratulations, Mr. Hunter," Marcus said, with the particular seriousness of a young man who knows what it means to have things turn out all right. He paused. "They are calling you settled now, you know, people in town, instead of what they used to call you." "Settled," Noah said. "Yes, sir." Marcus looked at him with steady eyes. "Better?" Noah considered it. "Truer," he said. Marcus nodded once, the way of a person who understands the distinction, and put his hat back on and went. Reverend Greer came the following Sunday, not in his formal capacity but simply as himself, carrying a small book that had been his wife's. She had been gone for many years. Greer was a widower, a book of Psalms that he pressed into Noah's hands and said, "Not as theology, as poetry. Your boy might like them someday." Noah thanked him and meant it. The winter was cold and quiet and full. There is a specific kind of life that a house becomes when it contains a new baby. The rhythms rearrange themselves around the small, insistent requirements of the new person, and everything outside the four walls takes on a slightly distant quality, the world continuing its business at some remove while the interior world, the important one, demands your full attention. Noah and Henrietta moved through the nights in shifts, and through the days in the specific productive tiredness of new parents, and they talked a great deal in the small hours in the way that sleep deprivation sometimes opens people up more honest, more willing to say things they might edit in the bright light of full consciousness. Noah talked about his life before Caldera Flats. The full version, not the summary, the years after Daniel died, the specific grief of losing the person who had been his only remaining family, the way grief that size can shape a person's sense of what they are allowed to want. He talked about the wandering and how it had not been entirely without purpose, even if it had not felt like anything other than moving while the pain moved with him. He talked about the first time he had tracked something and found it and understood that he was genuinely good at this, and how that had been for a long time the one thing that felt solid. "You have always been more than you thought you were," Henrietta said, rocking Daniel in the cold of 3 in the morning. "I know that now," he said. "You showed me. You showed yourself," she said firmly. "I simply declined to agree with the other version of you." She looked at him over the baby's head with sleepy, certain eyes. "There is a difference. A significant one," he agreed. "You always argued well," she said. "Even with Beaumont right at the beginning, you did not accept his framework. You asked him for evidence. Most people do not do that. They accept the framework because questioning it feels like arrogance. But you understood that requiring evidence is not arrogance. It is just honesty." "My brother taught me that," he said. He always said that a man who refuses to question what he is told is not humble. He is just a man with a smaller world." He paused. "He was right." "He sounds like he was wonderful," she said. "He was," Noah said. "You would have liked each other." She smiled. "Tell Daniel about him when he is old enough." "I will," he said. "I will tell him everything." Spring came around again with the irresistible momentum that spring always has in the high desert, everything pushing upward and outward, the sage flowering, the red country going briefly soft and green at its margins. Daniel grew at the rate that babies do, which is continuously and with great conviction, and was, by April, already demonstrating the particular stubbornness that Henrietta recognized as a family trait, and that Noah recognized as something he had no standing to dispute. Noah took a case in March, a missing cattle deed, a dispute over water rights between two ranching families that had been moving toward violence. He was gone for 5 days and came back with a resolution and a headache from the sustained close-quarters negotiation, which he was better at than he had been a year ago, though he would not have predicted that improvement. The town of Caldera Flats had reorganized itself around the Hunters in the way that towns do around a couple that has become, somehow, representative of something the community is working out about itself. The integration of the mining families into the same school as the cattle family's children, Henrietta's quiet, persistent, unargued project, had begun to normalize over the past 2 years in ways that were small but real. Children who had grown up knowing each other grew into young people who did business with each other, and the strict social geography of the town began to soften at its edges. Tulliver preached a sermon in May that did not mention Noah by name, but that was clearly, to anyone who had been paying attention, a partial retraction of the previous position. He preached about the difference between the letter and the spirit, about the error of confusing outward conformity with interior goodness, and about the particular poverty of a community that judges its members by reputation rather than by what they actually do. After the service, he shook Noah's hand in the street briefly, with the stiff dignity of a man who is making an effort. "I believe I was in error," he said, which was the most he could bring himself to offer. "I appreciate you saying so," Noah said, which was the most he needed. Henrietta, who was standing beside him with Daniel on her hip and the expression of someone watching something satisfying happen, said nothing, which was itself a kind of grace. Caldera Flats was growing. The silver operation had a new manager who was paying actual wages rather than scrip, a change forced through by a territorial labor investigation that had been partly prompted by the fraud case Noah had unraveled the previous November, whose evidence had connected to the mining company's practices through a shared set of financial backers. The connection had been unintentional on Noah's part. He had followed evidence where it led, as he always did, but the outcome had been, as Marcus Webb put it with satisfaction when the news came through, useful. A new doctor arrived in the summer, a woman named Dr. Frances Holt, who was 35 and had trained in Philadelphia, and who set up her practice on 3rd Street with brisk efficiency and a complete indifference to the surprise her presence generated. Henrietta befriended her within the week. Noah found her direct and competent, which were the two qualities he valued most in anyone. By midsummer, Henrietta told him she was expecting again. He took the news with somewhat more composure this time, though the emotion was no smaller. It had simply found a structure it recognized. He held her hand across the breakfast table and said, "November again." "October, I think," she said. "The arithmetic is slightly different." He had been thinking since Daniel's birth about what it meant to put down roots in a place. He had never owned land. He had lived in rented rooms and borrowed spaces for so long that the concept of property had become associated in his mind with something he was not quite eligible for, like a membership he had never applied to join. But Caldera Flats was different now. Caldera Flats had a school that his wife had built and was building still, and a church where a good man had offered him something that felt, when he was honest about it, like a form of welcome, and a street where he knew people's names and their stories and their complicated allegiances, and a small house with a kitchen garden and 2 bookshelves, and a desk made of elm wood, and a son who was learning to sit up with the concentrated effort of someone accomplishing something very important. He went to the Territorial Land Office in August. He filed a claim on a piece of land 2 miles east of town, a good piece, well-watered, with natural shelter from the north wind and good building ground on the slight rise above the creek line. He had enough from saved commissions for a down payment, and he had negotiated a second payment plan with the land office agent that was manageable if he continued working at his current rate. He told Henrietta at supper, and she set down her fork and looked at him. "Land," she said. "Yes." "Ours." "Yes." He watched her face, reading it the way he read everything that mattered. "Is that, I should have spoken to you before I—" "Noah Hunter," she said with a warmth in her voice that stopped him entirely. "You have just given us a home, not a rented room, not a borrowed space. A home." She looked at him steadily, her eyes bright. "Do not apologize for that." He let out a breath. "I want to build something there," he said. "A proper house, bigger than this one, room for the children." He paused. "Children, however many there are going to be." She laughed, the full, unguarded one. "However many," she agreed. They planned it over the following weeks, the house they would build on the creek property. He drew the plans himself, rough but workable, using the surveyor's skills he had picked up incidentally over years of tracking land disputes. She contributed the interior requirements with practical precision. A room with adequate windows for the school preparation she continued to do at home, a kitchen large enough to function, a separate sleeping room for the children that allowed the possibility of more than two. Construction began in September, after the heat had softened, with Noah doing the primary work and 3 men from town hired, on 2 of them fathers of Henrietta's current students, one of them Marcus Webb, who had developed real construction skills in the interim, and who worked with the focused competence of someone who takes craftsmanship seriously. The second baby came in October, as predicted, on a cool afternoon that had the slanted amber light of late autumn moving through the windows. Another healthy birth, again with Agatha Delray in attendance, again with Noah outside the door doing the only thing available to him, which was waiting and being present and accepting that some things require endurance rather than action. A girl. He held his daughter in the bedroom while Henrietta watched him with that open, luminous face, and the baby looked up at him with dark eyes that were already, in some quality he could not name, her mother's eyes. "Millicent," Henrietta said, "after my mother." "Millicent Hunter," he said, tasting it. "Yes. You are going to be absurdly devoted to her," Henrietta said. Probably, he agreed without embarrassment, he was. He was deeply, straightforwardly, unself-consciously devoted to both of his children, in a way that surprised the part of him that had spent a long time believing he was not someone who got to have this. The everyday closeness of children who know they are loved and demonstrate this, by testing the boundaries of every safe space they have been given with cheerful determination. Daniel, by 18 months, was a serious, watchful child who had apparently decided that observation was the correct approach to a world that rewarded patience very much, Henrietta said with amusement, his father's approach. Millicent, from her earliest weeks, was something else entirely opinionated, expressive, entirely uninterested in any situation in which she was not fully engaged. "She is you," Noah told Henrietta, watching their 3-month-old daughter make her views on a delayed feeding powerfully known. "She is both of us," Henrietta said, "which may be God's way of keeping us humble." The house on the creek property was finished by the following April, the spring of 1880, and they moved in on a day of brilliant, windy New Mexico light with Sam Wicks volunteering the use of his wagon and appearing to find the entire enterprise deeply emotionally affecting. It was a good house. Solid, well-made, larger than anything Noah had lived in since childhood. It had the windows Henrietta had specified, and the kitchen she needed, and the children's room and a front porch that looked out toward the mesa country with its perpetual play of light and shadow. He stood on that porch on the first evening they were there, and looked at it, and felt something he could only describe as rightness, the specific satisfaction of a thing being in its proper place. Henrietta came and stood beside him, Millicent on her hip, Daniel holding her other hand and looking at the view with the serious consideration he brought to new information. "What do you think?" she asked him. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the evening light came across the mesa and fell on the house, and the kitchen garden she had already planned, and on his children and on his wife, who was looking out at the territory with the expression she wore when she was being completely herself and completely happy simultaneously. "I think," he said, "that I have been wrong about one specific thing for a very long time." "Only one," she said, dry and warm. "One significant one." He looked out at the mesa. "I thought that a man like me did not get to have something like this. I thought the preachers had at least that much right, that whatever else they were wrong about, the life they were pointing toward, the settled thing, the rooted thing, I thought that was not available to me. And now," she said. "Now I think," he said, "that the preachers were wrong about almost everything, and that a man like me, specifically me, with my specific history and my specific doubts and my specific everything, is standing on his own porch with his family in the most beautiful country in the territory, and that this is, in fact, available to men like me." He paused. which I would argue with any preacher in the territory who wanted to debate it. She looked up at him with those steady, warm brown eyes. Would you? At considerable length, he said, with evidence. She laughed, and he kissed her there on the porch in the evening light, and Daniel, who was at an age where this sort of thing required comment, said "Papa" with mild authority, and Millicent made a sound of general enthusiasm, and the evening settled around them with the enormous soft weight of the New Mexico sky. Over the years that followed, and they were good years, built on solid ground, Noah Hunter became the kind of man that towns like Caldera Flats eventually produce enough of to constitute a type. Not a settled man in the reduced sense, not a man who has abandoned his larger self for the comfort of not moving, but a man who has discovered that rootedness and range are not opposites, that you can know a place deeply, love it specifically, be woven into it with all the complicated loyalty of real belonging, and still go out into the canyon country and find what needs to be found and come back with the truth of it. He still tracked. He still took cases, cattle disputes, missing persons, a county boundary fraud in 1881 that took him 6 weeks, and that Henrietta managed in his absence with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a 31-child classroom by herself, and had no difficulty operating a household plus a small cattle concern they had started on the creek property. He came back from each case to a house that was more lived in and warmer for each month that passed, and to children who were growing with the astonishing speed that children grow and who were, each of them, their own entire people. Daniel, at 5, was reading at a level that even Henrietta, who was professionally disinclined to make comparative claims about children's abilities, described as remarkable. He had Noah's quiet and Henrietta's precision, and a curiosity about the canyon country that manifested as extended outdoor investigations that required occasional retrieval. Millicent, at 3, had opinions about everything and expressed them without self-consciousness, which was either going to make her an extraordinarily effective person or an exhausting one, and Noah privately believed it was going to be both and had resigned himself to this with love. The third child, another boy born in 1882, named Thomas for no one in particular, just because it suited him, arrived in the usual way, and settled into the household with the ease of someone who has always known where he is going and is simply pleased to have arrived. Noah was at the birth this time because Agatha Delray, who had attended Daniel and Millicent's births, told Henrietta that there was no medical reason for the father to wait outside if Henrietta wanted him there, and Henrietta, who had opinions about efficiency and had no patience for traditions that existed without a good reason, said yes. He held Henrietta's hand throughout, and he was there when Thomas arrived, and he watched his son take his first breath, and he understood in that moment something about the particular quality of presence that he had been, all his life, not sure he deserved to offer, that being there, wholly there, was itself a form of love, not passive but active, not waiting but witnessing. He told Henrietta this afterward in the quiet, while Thomas slept and the older children were being minded by Clara Reyes next door. "You have always known how to be present," she said. "You were present for me from the beginning. I remember the morning you stood in the street watching me argue with Gideon Pratt." He smiled. "You were winning." "I was always going to win," she said, "but you stopped anyway." She looked at him with that quality she had of seeing through to the actual thing. "You stopped because you were interested, not just in the argument, in the person making it." "Yes," he said. "That is the whole story," she said. "You pay attention to people, really pay attention the way most people do not." And the preachers called that godless because it does not look like piety. It does not look like what they recognize as devotion. But it is. It is the most devotional thing I know. He looked at his wife in the warm light of their bedroom in their house on the creek property, with the canyon country outside and the mesa and the enormous sky, and he thought that she had given him more than the simple happiness of being loved. She had given him a framework for understanding what he already was, not a godless wanderer, not a man constitutionally unsuited to belonging, not the sum of every preacher's casual condemnation, but a man whose specific gifts attention, patience, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it led, the refusal to accept a reputation that had not been earned, were precisely the qualities that a life like this, the full and complicated and good life they were building, required. He had argued with 3 preachers in the territory, in one way or another, about his essential nature. He was glad he had argued. He was glad she had made him want to. On a Sunday in 1883, 5 years after he had ridden into Caldera Flats and watched a woman argue with a storekeeper, and felt something shift in him that he could not name, Noah Hunter sat in a pew at the Caldera Flats church. Not in the back, as he had that first time, but in the middle, with his wife beside him and Daniel on his other side and Millicent between Henrietta and a now much larger Thomas, who was a substantial and cheerful child of 14 months who had definite views about sitting still in churches, but who was, today, in one of his cooperative moods. Reverend Greer was preaching. He preached about the particular grace of imperfect people doing their best work in difficult circumstances. And it was a good sermon, honest and practical, and not in the least interested in making anyone feel they had arrived at the right destination by the wrong road. Noah listened, with the careful, patient attention he brought to everything, and thought that perhaps this was what faith actually was, or at least this was what it was for people like him, not certainty, not performance, not the confident navigation of an established map, but the willingness to pay attention to what was actually in front of you and to take it seriously and to keep showing up to the difficult places and doing the work and telling the truth about what you found there. He looked at Henrietta beside him, and she glanced at him at the same moment with the particular perception of a person who has learned to read someone very well over the years of really knowing them. She raised an eyebrow slightly, the private language of "what are you thinking?" He leaned close and said very quietly, "I am thinking that Beaumont was wrong." Her mouth curved. "He was wrong about a great many things," she whispered. "About one thing in particular," he said. She waited. "He called me godless," Noah said. "But I come here every Sunday with my wife and my children, and I try to do honest work and tell the truth about what I find, and I love the people in this house." He meant the house of his family, not the church building, and she knew it with everything I have. "If that is godless," he said, "I am prepared to argue the point at length." She took his hand under the pew, and her fingers threaded through his with the familiar warmth of 1,000 other mornings and evenings and midnights, the hands of a woman who had chosen him clearly and completely and without reservation. And he held her hand in his and faced forward, and let the sermon wash over him and the light come through the plain glass windows and fall on his children's serious and cheerful faces. And he was without drama, without announcement, with the quiet completeness of a man who has arrived at exactly the place he was supposed to be, entirely, specifically, irreversibly at home. Thomas fell asleep with his head against Henrietta's arm before the sermon ended, and Daniel whispered a question about the canyon passage they were going to ride through on Saturday, and Millicent arranged and rearranged a small wooden toy with focused silence until the final prayer, and Reverend Greer closed with a blessing that was simple and warm and aimed at no one in particular, and therefore, somehow, at everyone. The congregation filed out into the brilliant New Mexico morning, and Noah stood on the church steps with his family around him, and the town moved past with its greetings and its Sunday morning ease, and the mesa country stretched away to the horizon with its permanent, magnificent indifference to human categories, godless, faithful, settled, wandering, worthy, unworthy, all of them dissolving in this light, in this country, in this morning, into something simpler and truer. A man standing with his wife and his children on a bright Sunday in the New Mexico territory, in the year 1883, in a town that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to make room for the complicated people who did the difficult work. That was all. It was. It turned out everything.